James Barnes is a psychotherapist and mental health advocate based in Exeter here in the UK. He has a background in philosophy and psychoanalysis. He's currently working on reimagining and reconceptualizing the nature of mental disorder from a non-Cartesian starting point in order to advocate for non-reductive strategies of healing and recovery. James Barnes, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Hello, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
So first of all, if you could explain who you are and how you got here, because it sounds from when we were talking before the interview as if you have quite an interesting and varied background.
Yeah, well, I've been around a bit. I've been involved in mental health since the early 2000s when I was relatively young. I've worked in all sorts of roles. I studied in London, studied some philosophy related to psychology in London. And then ultimately I moved out to San Francisco, where I spent 7 years, and I trained at a school there as a psychotherapist, and then worked in a sort of a psychoanalytically oriented community mental health. It's a charity actually in San Francisco, really amazing place called RAMS. And I also studied some more philosophy there. And by a long route, I came back to England recently, only last September, via Mexico, where I spent a little while. And I came back ultimately because I'm come back to settle down, have a family. I wanted to get involved in the mental health scene here in particular. There's a strong kind of critical scene here, and I wanted to be a part of that. Yeah.
So what is your role now as far as working in mental health is concerned?
Right now, I'm an independent mental health advocate. I only, as I said, I only came back in September, and so I'm in the process of transferring my qualifications that I got in San Francisco to work as a psychologist here. And at the moment, I'm working in a psychiatric hospital here in Devon as a mental health advocate. Yeah.
So you are also, I understand, working on a book, and I imagine that it's in this process of reimagining and reconceptualizing the nature of mental disorder. And I was just wondering if you could explain that a little bit in kind of laywoman's terms, because I'm not entirely familiar with the concepts that you're using, and I think that it'll be fascinating for our listeners.
Yeah. Well, as we discussed before in our little exchanges, it's a very, very complicated, nuanced domain, not because it's necessarily complicated stuff, like it's not describing complicated experiences, but because it's become so complicated by our history of overthinking things, I would say, over-intellectualizing things, moving away from kind of concrete experience into the more abstract realms, which science has had a lot to do with, the scientific method, etc. But specifically referring to the Cartesian part of it, I think all of our psychology, certainly the main modalities such as CBT, such as psychiatry and the kind of models that it uses, Freudian psychoanalysis, and many others, they're all very much situated in this I call Cartesian, because at root it is Cartesian, the idea that we're separate subjects in relation to a neutral external world, and that all kind of quality or experience is kind of internal, and the world itself is kind of experienceless and just kind of mathematically structured and doesn't really have any quality. You led into all sorts of troubles with that distinction, and I think that clearly our psychologies are based on that being true. It's another way of talking about that as scientific materialism as well, which, although it talks about the whole world being, matter and scientifically explainable, it also is situated within the idea that it is the subject that has all the experience, as opposed to the world, which is just kind of totally neutral. And I think that's historically been a big problem, and I think that over time it's been shown to be a problem, philosophically, practically, and now ethically. I think with a lot of the movements we have that have really not come from within psychiatry or within psychology, but have been political and social movements, have shown up a lot of that philosophy to be really deeply flawed, and responsible for a lot of problems.
What kind of movements and changes of view are you talking about specifically there?
Well, I'm thinking the main example I have in my mind is how, you know, the kind of classic one is how homosexuality used to be considered a mental disorder, and it wasn't like there was some advance in psychoanalysis or some advance in psychiatry or science that showed us that wasn't true. It was a social movement that kind of forced that change. And I think, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was thinking, yes, that does help to elucidate it for me very helpfully. So thank you. And if during our conversation there are any occasions to bring up either examples, real world examples, or client examples that might help to put the story in a more concrete and less abstract
Absolutely,
form,
yeah.
that would be fantastic.
Yes.
I came across you actually for the second time because I didn't realize that a previous article I had read and enjoyed had also been by you, but on Eon magazine, the online magazine.
Yeah.
And you had written an article about Donald Winnicott, who a British psychotherapist, and one that's probably not so familiar to a large range of our audience. So I was wondering if you could give a broad brush introduction to Winnicott's ideas and work.
Yes, and I'll try and be more concrete because I do have a tendency to be quite abstract. You know, funnily enough, just to contextualize it, I think Donald Winnicott is in the background to a lot of different things we take for granted in psychotherapeutic practice, as long as it's not of the CBT variety. He's very much there. He's very much there in developmental psychology. There's a lot of things that we take for granted that I think he brought in a kind of contentious way at the time. The you know, the funny one is the kind of transitional object, or like blankie, you know, and how that for a child is something very special and something very unique. And that's a really good example of the transitional object that he talks about.
Yes, I had one, silky. It was a woolen blanket with a bit of silk
Yes.
on the end, and yes.
Yeah, and I think obviously that was kind of understood before his time, but he kind of brought that straight into the heart of the theory, where we have these objects that are kind of half ourselves and half the world, or half ourselves and half the mother, and that there's something about objects such as that and how we experience the world like that that is kind of both me and both world, both me, both other. It's a kind of a paradox, you would say, in between.
Yes, you mentioned in the article the in-between areas,
Yes.
and that struck me as a very powerful concept. And certainly, I can, you know, I can emotionally recall that sense of how that blanket had this emotional resonance with sort of security and safety. So, is that the kind of thing he's talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that he's a tricky one to talk about as well, because he's a theoretician of kind of paradox, and he writes paradoxically, and he's hard to follow in certain places, and he's hard to put into a system. But I think there's something about that experience that you're talking about that is central to what's there. It's central to attachment theory as well, that kind of came at the same time as Donald Winnicott. That there's something that isn't cognitive, it isn't objective, and it isn't really subjective. There's these things in the world, people in the world, objects in the world that we're deeply connected to, and that how they act towards us or what they mean for us has a big impact on how we feel about ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this sense of the interpersonal aspect of the self, and it struck me. I was recalling, and I think it's a philosophical concept, that I was listening to a podcast about philosophy and the idea of the self, and talking about the way in which we can outsource aspects of ourselves. So you might outsource, someone who was starting to suffer memory loss might outsource their memory onto pieces of paper and post-it notes around the house, and that would
Right,
become
right.
yeah, part of the self. Or in a long-term married couple, they might outsource their emotional security, or the one who remembers the birthdays, onto their partner, and that be a completely solid and stable framework of being. But after bereavement, they have genuinely lost part of self.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think it applies in all those ways. The idea that in this kind of dualistic or scientific model that I was talking about at the beginning, that doesn't really make sense. It's kind of like you'd say that's, that's like a convenient fiction or some kind of happy fantasy that would soothe the person, or it's as if they've lost a part of themselves, but really they're the same. But when you start talking in the way that Winnicott does, and when you start thinking of kind of the essence of selfhood, the essence of our emotions, the essence of our self-concept as intimately tied to the world, to others, and to the objects in it. And in some sense, those objects and those others are infused with ourselves, then it makes a whole different kind of sense. And it's this kind of paradoxical thing of it's an object, but it's also me. So it's only there as long as I'm there. And if it's another person, if that other person is no longer there, then that part of me that I was also goes, because it's something that is, as you're saying, the in-between world. It exists in this paradoxical in-between, like Blanky, it's the same kind of thing.
And it just suddenly struck me in a way that feeling of expansion that people can get in sort of transcendental experiences, it's almost as if that is kind of a bigger or more abstract framing of something that's happening normally in our experience, although we don't really recognize it as such.
Yes, I think so. It's interesting, actually. My wife is currently writing a paper. She's also a psychotherapist, and she's writing a paper on the different models of psychotherapy. And we're actually talking about transpersonal psychology, which is related to what you were just talking about. And I think that there's definitely a way to think about how we relate to, the divine or the transcendent or the collective unconscious. It's a similar kind of thing where you're having this relational sort of co-creation between two things that doesn't exist within either. You know what I mean?
It seems to me then that that ideas of the sacred, or of a kind of, I don't know, noumenal connection with nature, or with sort of something spiritual, seems to be a natural craving for people if there is this natural inclination to simultaneously invest the world with meaning, and also to have that radiation of meaning from the world.
Yes, exactly. I think that this is where we could veer off into something very philosophical and abstract. But I think that what Winnicott does with relationships to others, in the way that we talked about, or even relationships to deeply meaningful objects, I think that's philosophically been done to nature itself, to the universe itself, by such people as Heidegger and Alfred North Whitehead, where for both the world itself, nature itself, is relationally created with you, and that it has something to bring to you. And there's two aspects of the experience, and it all kind of exists in this in-between world. But that is quite a heady, abstract thing to get into.
It is quite a heady, abstract thing, and we might go a little bit further that way later. But I think we should sort of hone into how this impacts on the way that one regards both trauma and the relationship with the therapist or the analyst. Right. So how do those two things play out in the context of this different interpretation of selfhood?
Yes. Well, yes, I'm thinking back to your first question. I didn't give a very good synopsis of Winnicott. I just went into kind of transitional stuff. But I think the key to that, the key to Winnicott, is that it moved from the this idea that the therapist is, a separate person doing something to a separate experience over there in the room, changed very much to this kind of the therapeutic experience and the actual experiences that are happening sort of happen in this relationally in this shared space. So it's a very, very different model. And one of the reasons why trauma, say, was not a big thing for Freudian psychoanalysis and things that came subsequently is because of that very model, the idea that your experience is generated inside of you. So even if something happens in the outside world, what's really important is your internal experience. So we'll look at that, we'll look at your reactions. The world itself is kind of neither here nor there. It might be some sort of trigger, but what's important is how you react to it. Whereas for a Winnicott, who is talking in this very relational kind of way where it's co-created, then the experience itself is very much dependent on the world and dependent on the others in it. So how others act, how the world acts in experience, determines how you feel about that. And so big lapses in the world or big lapses in the other, big lapses in the therapist, big lapses in the parent, is inherently kind of traumatic. It takes away security in an abrupt way. And so it's fundamentally there in the developmental model and in the psychotherapy model.
That is fascinating, and it made me think of I also had, as well as Silky, we're going into a really personal thing here, Goldie Teddy. My older brother had given me when I was a baby, and I ate all the fur off Goldie Teddy, and I totally internalized Goldie Teddy, but but I had him. It was not a question of not being with Goldie Teddy. And when we were living in California, actually, we were originally staying in a hotel, and he got wrapped up with the bedclothes one day and lost. And having that tear away. I mean, traumatic episodes with people are have obviously been far more damaging, but but you can think about it with the transitional object as a kind of easy example to show the way in which those lapses have an impact. I mean, the world, it was then Goldie Teddy-less, and it was a different world.
Right. In the loss of the Teddy, then that opens up a big absence, a big gap in what you take for granted in your experience of the world. Suddenly it's very, very different. There's a gap, and that gap needs to be filled. And if there isn't the kind of environment around you that can sort of soothe that and fill that, then that will remain a gap, and that becomes a trauma.
And obviously for children who have, if a parent is absent through some depression, or absent through being absent or dying or something like that, then that kind of lurch and loss would be, exponentially greater.
Exactly. And I think that is what Winnicott focuses on, exactly those kinds of things. And you can certainly, as with Freud, you look back on it, and he's talking a lot about mothers, which is a kind of problem in itself. So just to talk about caregivers, the main parental caregiver that's there, just as the first most powerful other in the world, the way they come and go, and both physically and mentally is hugely impactful, because it's directly changing the infant and the child's sense of self and sense of certainty and reality.
You mentioned in the article experiential units, and so are those experiential units are actually, I suppose, sort of like dyadic units.
Yes. Winnicott said at one point, which has often been quoted, there is no such thing as an infant. That it doesn't exist. You only find an infant with a mother, or with a primary caregiver. Without a mother or a primary caregiver, there really isn't an infant. They're kind of just I would say like, you know, a massive absence because there's no link there. But I think that was at the root of his theory. One of the first papers he wrote was exactly on the parent-child relationship, and he was talking about exactly that it's kind of this sort of merged single entity. You know, when the child is born, it's this sort of totally open and suffused experience between mother and baby, or between parent and baby, in which sort of, yeah, being is continuous amongst the two, and that initial stage is absolutely vital for growth. It's sort of, you know, what may happen with animals while pregnant, while in the womb, for us happens later because we're so late, sort of delayed birth. And that there's this kind of symbiotic relationship that's foundational, and how that is negotiated by the parents and by the world ultimately kind of determines your sense of self, personality in different ways, and the kind of, you know, mental health qualities and issues you might have later.
Even in research with rats, I think they found that the mothers who lick their babies generate happier, healthier offspring than mothers who don't. And I know, you know, one can look at that as a pure sort of hepatic, a pure touch thing, but I mean, well, for a rat, that's, I mean, where's the distinction begin and end between something that's a purely physical and nurturing,
right,
and something that's psychologically nurturing?
right.
So this thinking is changing the way that you would advocate for the mental health of people who are suffering, and how would that impact on the ways in which they were diagnosed or treated or helped through their lives?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that the sort of the psychiatric model, the DSM classifications, and various cognitive theories of mental disorder, even the very concept of mental disorder, which is as some sort of internal dysfunction, I think is very, very flawed and very problematic. And I think that if you think of it in terms of, at heart, we're kind of relational. We've come from this relational womb with the parents, and we live in a relational, more complex relational womb throughout our lives. Then you don't need the kind of explanations that psychiatry gives for what a mental disorder is. It's not like you have to invoke this brain disease or brain disorder to explain these experiences. There's a continuous, meaningful narrative and story of how the person has negotiated their emotional self with others in the world, and how the world and others have failed them, and that even with experiences such as psychotic experiences, that you can make a lot of sense out of it in that way. And it's not to ask, you know, like, what's wrong with you right now? It's to ask, you know, what has happened to you throughout your life that you've developed these kinds of ways of negotiating your experience and negotiating the world as a kind of best solution to adversities, as a productive response rather than some kind of pathology or reduction. So I think it's hugely important in how we conceptualize it, but also in what we would do, the kind of interventions we would have. So if we say that this kind of interpersonal and interworldly sort of lapses and trauma is at the root of a lot of mental suffering, then, you know, we wouldn't, certainly our first response wouldn't be to medicate, or shouldn't be to medicate, and it wouldn't necessarily be to kind of challenge the conscious thoughts or the attitudes or the behaviors that the person has. It would be to enter into meaningful, caring, reparative kinds of therapies, for example, and also, because it's not just limited to individuals and others, and we might want to look at the social circumstances that people are in, right? It's like they're really important in this, and they're exactly what is kind of forgotten in these narratives of brain disorder, you know.
Has been a big movement in England. I don't know how much this crosses other cultures, but over here I understand that there has been quite a big movement to say, well, wait a minute, there are a lot of people who are under real social hardship, social deprivations. There are incredible difficulties as well as family traumas that are really not going to help people to thrive and flourish in the community. And so those aspects then you're suggesting should also be really taken into account. So don't just learn how to deal psychologically with being unemployed and perceived to be unemployable, but you know, this is a real problem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that it's one of the things I tried to say. I had limited space in the article, was that although for Winnicott it's very much about the immediate, most important relationships you have, to me and logically it expands just the relationship with the world and to the society you're in, the culture you're in, the micro cultures that you're in. They're just as important, especially as you get older, and they're having impacts in the same way. You know, the way that our microcultures, culture at large, society is failing us and is forcing us to live with various conflicts that leaves big absences in our lives. They become traumatic in that sense, and there's a lot of work that can be done on that level, and arguably that's the most important level.
Yes. If I were to be devil's advocate, there would be, you know, two points. One would be, well, are we denying that people have any form of responsibility? And on the more useful side of that, but how can we change the world? The only thing that one can do is change the individual. So on those two bases of, you know, of seeking to sort of push responsibility away from the individual, and also perhaps there being a sense of the individual being disempowered by not being able to do something for themselves to ease their emotional hardships.
Yes, no, I take that point, and I agree with that. It's definitely a more complex, nuanced picture, because of course it's like the environments that you're in and the networks you're in are also kind of internalized in some way. So that, you know, it's a very tricky thing, because I mean, certainly you can look at the, you know, in these terms, the self, or yeah, let's say the self having a role in how all that is digested, how all that is processed, and of course, like conscious, deliberate, intentional acts can affect the whole system. So there's no doubt about that. But I think I partly I think most importantly, there's a need to counterbalance a very individualistic narrative at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually it's like finding the space between in the therapy as well, that you're saying, well, these are ways in which you can change behaviors perhaps, or, you know, in order to sort of like help in the short term, but there are also sort of externals that are an issue. So that makes sense, doesn't it? That where it just does seem to make sense.
Yes. Yeah, I would say that it very much does make sense, that kind of in between that we were talking about. I think it's a question of, you know, I myself, I meant to say at the beginning, I say outwardly that I've had mental health, quote unquote, mental health issues in the past, and have had a lot of therapy myself. And I learned a hell of a lot from that, and I developed quite a lot of ways of being, capacities that really helped me in life. So I on the one hand, I definitely feel like the kind of social part of our experience is very important and under represented and undervalued. But at the same time, I know from my own experience that irrespective of what's going on in the world, you can develop ways of coping with yourself and your world that will certainly help you. I think there's a danger there, given that's true, of putting the responsibility on the individuals again too much. Like, it's why should it be? Take the example of, say, somebody living in a black person living in a very racist society.
Mm.
You know, how can you, even though maybe getting some therapy around some of the trauma around that will be very helpful, it's you can't locate the responsibility in them or the issues in them. It's just that there are ways of dealing with it in that way which could be very helpful as well.
Wasn't there an attempt at one stage to pathologize slaves who attempted to escape, by that being escaping slave syndrome?
Yes.
And I mean, one sees the ways in which sort of the powerful sides of a dominant culture can dramatically impact the ways that we interpret behaviors. I was thinking when you were talking about that, and I mentioned to you in our discussions beforehand that I'd read a book recently by Carl Cederstrom called The Happiness Fantasy, and he sort of like runs through quite a scathing critique of the whole self-actualization movement, really because it seems to put all the responsibility onto the individual. So, you know, if you're not succeeding, you're just not meditating enough, you're not having a stoic enough attitude to insults and injuries, you know, you need to work harder, do more yoga, whatever it is. And that ultimately all the responsibility lies with you, and that means that those people who are not succeeding in a given society, they deserve to be in the position that they're in, and that just does seem to be incredibly harsh and wrong.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. Yeah, it's a very seductive and powerful thing, this idea that you know, we can be in control of how we feel, and we can just fend off bad feelings and kind of like meditate our way to indifference or happiness even. And in some cases, you know, obviously some of those things are very helpful and productive, but they can't take the place of what's underneath, I don't think, and the need for a different kind of repair. You know, it's hard for an individual to mend something that involves the world and other people in it. You know, it needs a relational kind of response, I think.
And I, you know, from a personal perspective as well, I agree with you on where you said with your experience that, you know, there are clearly these benefits from learning certain tools, but also within therapy, the support that, you know, I can see how that relationship at times has been incredibly nurturing. And isn't there quite a lot of research suggesting that in all forms of therapy, irrespective of the school, the one key component that seems to correlate with better outcomes is the relationship between the therapist and the client? Right.
Absolutely. And so I don't know if you've noticed in the media here at the moment, there's quite a lot of it seems to kind of sneak in on the narrative in the media around mental health, of the use of kind of apps, mental health apps. And it's quite ironic, really, that I think, to my knowledge, this is, you know, being backed by the NHS, kind of sort of trying to, you know, under the admirable guise, I guess, of trying to reach as many people as possible given limited resources, but still, given that that's firm knowledge now that the relationship is a vital factor. It's interesting that you know, there can be this, you know, apparently cutting edge intervention of giving out sort of cognitive behavioral apps.
Yes, it does seem, and what we were saying about those kind of like levels of dependency, to feel that, you know, the individual combined with an algorithm should be able to combat all the, you know, different levels of trauma that they've sort of undergone in the past, just does, and it also denies what we were talking about it a little bit in passing earlier, this you know, this inevitable interdependence that there is. And I think during the pandemic, We've seen here in the UK, as well as people have globally, I'm sure, the real proof of the dependence we have on the people who organize supply lines and who continue delivering things, the people who are stocking shelves in supermarkets, and any person's conception that they are an individual who stands alone, yes, we can be shut down in isolation, and there is that sense of individualism, but we are utterly dependent on a vast framework of people we'll never meet. And if those things break down, it's that would be, I mean, if society broke down, that would be like everybody's mother falling by the wayside.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think then we'd be confronted with the fact that you don't need to have supposedly dodgy genes to have a psychotic experience.
No. Well, globally, there almost seem to be well, I don't know, on a vaster scale, a kind of psychotic experience in the way in which we've divorced humanity from nature, and now we have this looming crisis of climate change, and we really see that there's a very powerful interdependence there as well. And I don't know, with the more philosophical side of the work that you've done, do you sort of like think about things on those like vast network scales as well as on individuals within families and communities?
I definitely do, yeah. More so recently. I think that, especially coming back to England recently, that has such sort of, at least it's from my childhood, from my original mix-up with the world, this kind of nature and this kind of world, that I think that the disconnection we have from it is palpable, and I think that to extend Winnicott to something a bit more philosophical and transpersonal evil. Interesting.
Horrible Freudian slip.
Mother Nature, the original mother. It's like the first, the most important background security and taken for grantedness that there is, and that in a certain sense, individual mothers or parents kind of pale in comparison to the state of the actual world and nature that we live in, which is being horribly degraded and catastrophically kind of messed up, and has been for some time. I think that has profound effects before we're even kind of, or while we are growing up with our parents. It's there in the background and it infuses the whole thing. And there's somebody, I forget what it was, and I'll misrepresent the quote, but it was something like the revenge of the dissociated or something. It basically, in relation to, if you dissociate something as opposed to repress, if you dissociate it and it's completely out of your awareness, it will come back with a vengeance and kind of attack you out of your awareness. And I think there's something about that in what's happening now.
It feels like it. It's segue slightly. It's you're in Devon, where I'm originally from, and a county of England that I dearly love and find to be the most beautiful place on earth. And you trained in San Francisco, very near to where Dr. Dave lives. So there's a sort of peculiar synchronicity or in between there as well. But I remember, growing up, and I'm substantially older than you, and in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, the amount of freedom that children had was remarkable. I was an only child from my mother's second marriage, and a lot younger than my siblings. And, I had a dog, and I had feet, and I walked, and later I had a pony, and I would go sort of like 20 miles on my pony when I was 11 or 12, and onto Dartmoor and across the fields, and had this incredible freedom of just sort of me in the countryside. And Dartmoor felt to me, and still does, it has a presence. And when I was thinking about the work that you were doing, it actually feels to me the way that you know, that idea of an open awareness of consciousness, where there isn't a sort of, you know, a kind of positive or negative, it's just awareness. And Devon, to me, totally, the Dartmoor has that quality to me, just that waiting. And it feels like I'm tuning in to something that is part of me when I'm there, and it's very interesting to think how sort of profoundly connected I feel to that experience of that landscape.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get at, not so eloquently as you, about here and nature here, particularly in Devon. It's especially because we were children here. There's something very, you know, it's kind of like this idea of, you know, you can kind of clear your head when you can go in nature, and, you know, that it's good for your mental health or something, that kind of thought. But it's actually, to me, something far more deeper than that. It's kind of, losing these kind of false separations that we walk into, and just kind of wandering around in yourself, ultimately.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it did. And it really did feel like that. It didn't feel so much as if it was kind of like caring about me actively, but it felt like it was me. Yes, it is an astonishingly powerful feeling. I came across recently in a podcast interview an American philosopher called Donald Crosby, who came up with this idea of a religion of nature, which is totally not no sort of theism there. It's you know, nature is kind of enough. And he, for one thing, just sounded an incredibly compassionate and clear thinking man. But one of the things he said that really struck me, we have this idea that all values come from sort of consciousness and from the way that we interpret things, and that the world is just, as you were saying at the beginning, this kind of dead matter. But he was saying, look, you know, a tree sucks up water, it needs that to survive. Water has an inherent value for a tree. And if you sort of think about things, you know, and if you're an amoeba, something that's too saline is disvalued, something that's the right pH for you is valued, not in any sort of conscious way, but there is this kind of inherent value in the world, I think.
Right.
And when we disenchant it so utterly, it loses all of that matteringness that is actually there.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at before, in terms of Heidegger and Whitehead in particular. But that idea, the kind of the sort of cardinal error, in my opinion, and a lot of others that I've learned from and got these thoughts from, of Western thought, you know, classically comes with Descartes. It's not really his responsibility necessarily, but it's a whole shift in zeitgeist, where all the quality and all the meaning and all the value in the world was kind of withdrawn into the self, you know, to save it from Newtonian science. So Newton seems to be able to explain the entire universe. So in order to save our values and our love and our religion, we have to withdraw it into the self, and we say that it's all something that's happening inside the parameters of the body. But that was a mistake, and philosophical, practical, and whatever, it allowed science to do what it's done, which is obviously it's done hugely important things because it did it on that basis, but it's led us severely astray. And I think that it's radical to talk in those terms. But Whitehead, who was a very famous British mathematician and philosopher, he was talking about that in the 20s, as was Heidegger. Then the Second World War happened and everything changed, I think, as far as I can see. But it's there that it was all kind of all worked out in the 20s, and then we just went on this whole tangent. I feel like.
And lost a lot of wisdom, lost a lot of insight. So is this the kind of area that you're going to be covering in your book, and how far along are you progressing? What's the sort of time scale for that work? When can we start to order you from our independent retailers?
Well, actually, what I'm doing is I'm kind of writing it's like a selection of papers that are hopefully then turn into chapters. So I'm just doing it piecemeal like that. And as I was saying, I have a baby on the way. My wife is 8 months pregnant,
Oh
so
my goodness.
yeah, so it's probably going to go on the back burner for a bit, because that's a little bit more important, certainly in the short term.
Yes,
So yeah,
and creating that in between space as well between you.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I personally haven't had that much experience with children. Um, Obviously, being a child myself, I've had that experience, but I'm really, really excited and fascinated to be going through that really intimate process with my own child. I mean, I'm really kind of frighteningly excited about it.
Oh, that is absolutely wonderful. And I think on that note of supreme hope, let me thank you, James Barnes, for being on
Thank you.
Blink Rap Radio.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.